Lou's mother died when he was 12. As the oldest of his siblings, Lou experienced his dad's stoic grieving style, controlling the family dynamic of non-communication. Now, many years later, and for the past 20 years, he has counseled those who have lost loved ones, including members of the gay community. He has much wisdom and strength to offer as he eloquently describes a personal journey leading to the service of others.
We knew something was severely wrong. He didn't actually mention to any of us that my mom was on her deathbed and that she had a terminal illness. I happened to work in the hospital where she was residing, her last hospital stay. I was a volunteer there. So I knew more than my siblings, that I'm also the oldest of the 4 children. So I asked my father several weeks before my mom died if mom was dying, at which point he acknowledged that she was. He didn't show any emotionality at that point. He just answered my questions. I caught him crying, weeping in our kitchen early one morning, and that's when I realized it was having a tremendous impact on him. I think he would have said that he was protecting us from that kind of grief. And I think that's very typical of a lot of fathers and a lot of parents, is the tendency to not only protect their children from what they think is going to be this powerful and palpable range of emotions and loss, but it's almost the magical way of thinking about taking the loss away. And what my dad didn't realize, and what a lot of parents don't realize, is it's really not the most beneficial way of role modeling around loss and around grieving. The fact was that we were losing my mom. And I see this not just with my siblings and myself. We've talked, my siblings and I think this happens when there's more than one child in the family. You almost become a de facto support group to one another. But in our case, it didn't happen for many years later. We continued to follow my father's lead and not talk about it, and remain stoic about it, as if it didn't happen. So there's an as-if quality to what happens with death and dying. That's it, and it set a tone. It set a din of not only magical thinking and kind of almost illusional thinking, as though mom were alive. My father kept everything as it was in the house, as if mom were still there. He kept clothes in her closet. He kept things of hers around, personal effects. So it was kind of up to us to begin to kind of dismantle that physically as well as emotionally. And I would, years later, have a talk with an aunt of mine who would say, you know, your father erected a mausoleum in that house and a memorial to your mother, but it really didn't do you children any great service. So, and you know, in talking to my siblings, we had very parallel experiences of what we went through in that kind of numb period of not talking about it and acting as if nothing really happened. But the loss was all around us. Every time we'd have an event or a birthday or a holiday or a graduation or a wedding, the loss was there. And so in the more meta, I think we live in a culture that doesn't like to talk about loss, so we don't. I think we're doing a little better at it than perhaps we were 30 years ago when my mom did pass away, but I think we've a long way to go in terms of helping not only young people, but people in general, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a family member, a good friend, talk about loss. Western philosophy does not think about it. We kind of medicalize loss. We talk about keeping people alive. We talk about legal things and medical, do not resuscitate, in hospitals. But being a social worker and having worked in a hospital and dealing with grief and loss, not only on a personal level but on a clinical level, I realized that the families that were dealing with this loss were not prepared at all to deal with what was about to come. So it was our job, basically, and really the only one in that hospital staff, or perhaps in those people's lives, that would talk openly and fluidly about what was about to happen and how this would impact them the rest of their lives. So I think that there's a lot with the internet and with some programs on television and on cable. I think, and shows like Oprah. I think there have been portals that have been opened up that allow and give permission for people to talk about their emotional realms and what that loss means to them. But I think that there are many layers of loss. And I think they're a different range. You asked about a child losing a parent. A child losing a parent is the child's mind and having the developed mind that they have to cope with that loss. That's very different than an adult dealing with a loss. Not to minimize the loss, but it's different. The child thinks differently about loss. They don't have the ability to abstract think, to really conceptualize what loss is. When I worked on an AIDS ward in a city hospital years ago, we were working with children we were working with basically art therapy, where we would help children to describe their feelings by drawing things with crayons and with paint to talk about what the loss of a parent was, especially an abrupt loss to AIDS, or in so many cases both parents within a year or several years of one another, what that loss meant to them and how they were dealing with it, to get into the mind of the child. So I wanted to kind of just make that distinction because I think it is an important distinction. Well, I think an important question to bear in mind for a parent, particularly as it relates to dealing with the children, is why am I telling this child this and what is the purpose of it? So I think that becomes a gauge or a barometer around what might be too flooding or too much information for a child. Right, so you're talking about the other end of the spectrum, which is perhaps a parent over-disclosing. And so when I consult with patients of mine, for instance, who are dealing with not just death, but even a divorce, which is a form of loss, how much gets disclosed to the child is entirely left to the parent and to the judgment of the parent. So what I would counsel a parent around is how much of this is a burden to this child and how much of this is to ease this child into dealing with the loss. Who is this for? So if a parent begins disclosing things and using the child as a confidant or a counselor, a de facto counselor, which happens in some families, particularly in families that are isolated or are overly connected, where there's perhaps a crippling overly dependency on the part of not just the parents but also the child, in other words codependency. You find that the parent may be actually burdening the child with too much information and over-processing and exposing them to too much information. Well, let's go to the hospital and let me bring the child to the hospital. Well, why is the child being brought to the hospital? Why is the child being told all of this really pertinent medical information, but what is it doing to the child emotionally? Does the child need to? And I would say take your cue from the child. When the child begins to ask questions, you really have to gauge as a parent or as any guardian what wants to be shared and why. How old is the child? How much can they absorb of it? And know your child, right? Some children that may be 11 or 12, as in my case, we're inquiring and we're a bit more mature and could handle it. I could handle it. I was already volunteering at that hospital. I could handle not just the medical information, but I wanted to know. It's probably what informed my becoming a social worker and a psychoanalyst. I was curious about it, right? So in the case of my father, were I to counsel him, to back to your question, is to say, know your child, know what they can handle. Right? Not all children are built the same. They're all at different ages, they're all at different development, and we all have different personalities and abilities to absorb information differently. So in the case of one of my sisters, who was very fragile at the time and probably couldn't have handled as much about it, she could today. She's probably one of the strongest emotionally out of the four of us. But at the time, she wasn't because of other circumstances. To know the child and know what they can handle. I'll talk about yesteryear. I'll talk about my own experience because that was over 30 years ago. There was, in fact, very negligible contact with teachers, with guidance counselors. Yes, they knew. Clearly, the school had been informed. but we were also living in a very different age. And I think when we're talking about the cultural numbness of a society and how it deals with and grapples with death and loss, institutionally, a middle school or high school guidance counselor or teacher wasn't at that time prepared to talk with a child, much less their own children, about death and dying. I think my father was very representational of a typical parent or adult during that age. Now, I think it's perhaps shifted, where there is much more emotional maturity and a fluidity of our cultural narrative about loss, so that a teacher is perhaps more prone to asking a child to stay after class to talk and just check in with them, to perhaps talking. But we're also dealing with an internet age where there's also a level of disconnect between children and adults and children. So it's a level of, I would posit the answer in the following way. It depends on where it is and who it is and what school system you're talking about, how connected those parents are to that school system. In an urban school system, it's a pot shot in terms of, and a gambit in terms of whether or not that parent or parents are really that connected to their school or to the child's teachers. But I don't know that there's anything formulaic. Again, I would answer in the following way. I think it's really determined by the individual. And so in working with a particular patient, what I would really decipher after a while and differentiate is where is this patient right now? What are they dealing with? How long will the grieving process be for them? When or if they're able to actually get on with it, and what that looks like, to be able to explore that with them. Are they, certainly when someone loses a partner or loses a family member, they're not ready to re-engage with a new relationship if it were a spouse or partner, certainly within a reasonable amount of time. But some people have a grieving process that's much longer than others. So it really depends, and the grieving process is not linear. So that there's not, a point at which one says, okay, you've had a year, now it's time to get on with things. You get back to the gym, get back to work, get back on the dating site so you can start, dating and getting into a new relationship. I've had patients that have been in new relationships within months of a partner passing. I've had other patients who were never connected again to another intimate relationship. So in terms of preparedness, it's really what that patient wants, what that individual wants, how they see their life moving forward, right? So it's like any loss. If you lose a job, do you want another? Do you want another job in that field? Or do you want to start over in something completely different? Do you want to work out of your home? Do you want to work freelance? It's no different with the loss of a loved one. Particularly if it's a spouse or partner, exploring the question as to whether or not somebody wants to get involved in a new relationship is months, if not years out. What I generally recommend is for people not to date for at least a year, a minimum of a year after they've lost a loved one. Because they're just, whether they know it or not, they're not really emotionally capable of really knowing the full extent of what that loss represents. And it doesn't mean things aren't going to come up along the way. They come up after somebody's been remarried or recoupled for years. But at that point, they're just so confused. You've heard people say, don't make any major life decisions after a major loss for at least a year. That's true whether it involves a relationship, moving, selling assets, getting re-involved with somebody, having another child, if it were the loss of a child, to really kind of think about it and temper that decision. Well, when there's a sudden loss, and I usually use the reference point of what happened during 9/11, and it happened not only to the 3,000 people down at Ground Zero, but it happened to this entire city, is there was an acute loss, and it happened suddenly. No one could have been prepared for it. And so it becomes a form of what I call an ambiguous loss. It's ambiguous because there's no real way of defining what that loss means and how it came upon so suddenly, and how it impacts the individual or individuals in the case of this city. to go back into an office building, after one has lost a colleague, okay, in the Twin Towers, it can be devastating. To simply ride an elevator or get in a subway again. So it is what I would call an acute loss. Now again, I think it really needs to be nuanced, because I don't think that even in the case of someone that has known for a while that someone will be lost, how well that person is prepared for that loss, how they, in the case of myself with my family, we were not well prepared for it. It was, in a sense, even though my mom was ill for over 2 years, it was an acute loss for each of us because it came on suddenly, right? So how people are prepared for that loss, and how a child in this case is prepared for a loss, or an adult is prepared for a loss, there's no way to truly prepare for it, okay? I think there is a nuance difference when it's something like a plane crash, or a plane crashing into a building, and the loss of 3,000 people suddenly. It's a crisis. It's always a crisis. But an acute crisis is like an acute crisis in an emergency room. It's handled differently than something that comes on over time. Okay? So something that comes on over time, if someone has chest pains or pain in their abdomen, they might go to their own doctor. Right? It's a dull pain, but it's been there a while. Okay? It's not the kind of thing that is needed to go to a hospital emergency room right away. The pain is no less over time, but it's how it's dealt with, and it's how that doctor or that emergency room team deals with that pain and that individual, how it's attended to. How our city dealt with the loss of 3,000 people and the loss of our own safety. That safety net that was there before was something that no one could have been prepared for, and still aren't prepared for. Now it's kind of a foregone conclusion. We've lost that safety net, right? But it was represented through an acute loss. We were kind of a naive city, in that sense that we walked around with a sense of, perhaps false sense of safety, that we were impenetrable, right? And the same thing is true of a body, of an individual, that we're impenetrable. And that's what I meant when I was talking about the notion of talking about loss. We're losing from the moment we're born, right? We're losing our mobility. We're losing our youth, for that matter, right? But we're now just getting around to talking about what that loss means, and loss is part of life. But the more that we are prepared in terms of that process, the less it becomes a shock upon the system. And they've done these kinds of studies even in the United States, where they've actually observed family members in hospital settings when a family has been told that a family member is about to die and has a terminal illness. I remember as a graduate student reading some studies about how different groups handle not only the loss, but the terminal illness itself very differently. For instance, they studied Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, and WASP Americans. Okay? And it was remarkable, the distinctions and the differentiation between these ethnic groups. And they were observed in their settings of the hospitals and their homes, of how they were dealing with the prognosis of the fact that someone they loved was about to die, and then the eventual death, and how they coped with that and how they reacted to it. So from a very, very stoic and very kind of numb reaction in many of the cases of, often it was the Episcopalian WASP, who would hold back and would say nothing, particularly amongst other family members or around anyone else. They would express very little emotionality, okay, to the wailing that took place at Irish or Italian wakes. Okay, so how we deal with it, how we cope, is predicated upon not only our families of origin, but our cultures of origin. What we're told is the norm within our tribe, if you will, okay, of what's okay to do. Being Italian American, I grew up with a lot of emotionality, so it was okay to actually cry and to wail. However, the only parent that was our guidepost was my father, who himself individually was very stoic and did, as a lot of Italian American men, were not expressing their emotions well. Now, had it been the reverse, we've often speculated, my siblings and I, and it was my father who was given that terminal illness and not my mother, I think that the outcome perhaps would have been very different, because our mother was already giving us permission to express that emotionality. So I think it does really, culture does play a part. Not just the culture of where we are raised in terms of these United States, but also our own smaller communities, our nuclear families, our ethnic backgrounds, right? What the mores are within those cultural backgrounds, and how they're either kept to or they're moved away from. So somebody who is a first-generation Italian or Dominican American versus somebody who's been here for 4 or 5 generations, it's going to have a very, very different kind of reaction for them. Stress, you know, and certainly there's nothing more stressful, with the exception of perhaps a physical move out of state or out of the country, that stresses the body and stresses the system more than the loss of a loved one. So yes, it's a physiological reaction to have the immune system lowered. We know this, right, scientifically, we know this through studies, that when the body is stressed, the immune system is not functioning and the body tends to shut down. So the immune system is a moderator of that kind of stress level. So in getting people back to a certain stasis of saying, okay, this was either an acute or a long-range loss for you. Now, what's going to happen now, and how do we get you back to a certain homeostasis of functioning and getting you back into the world? Right? So that might involve medication. It certainly will involve psychotherapy, support groups. Yes, going back, getting to the gym. Okay. Nutritional supplements, eating a healthy diet. Sleep is something that's very, very, very much underestimated in terms of people's functioning in the world. When someone loses a loved one, sleep is very, very much interrupted, and for sometimes long periods of time. I worked with patients that couldn't sleep and couldn't get their biorhythms back years after the loss of a partner or a spouse. Just the idea of sleeping with somebody in the same bed for 25 or 30 years is powerful. I can't be in that bed. I can't be in that room. I can't be in the house. And for others, it might be a place of comfort, where that's the only place they can rest. It really depends, again, on the individual. Well, what I think you're touching on and highlighting is how we deal with change. Loss is a form of change. So how we as a culture and how individuals deal with change is dependent upon the individual. Are they, and as a species, as a human species, humans are resistant to change by our nature. That's why moving an apartment, simply moving an apartment within a city here, freaks the system out. It overwhelms and floods the system. We're creatures of habit, and we get comfortable in those habits. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, yes, getting a new piece of furniture, changing a room around, or even moving and going to a new space becomes a symbolic representation of that change. How much that person can handle the change is entirely up to that person. Am I ready to change? Am I ready to move on? Am I ready to rearrange the furniture, as it were, or to share my bed with another human being? Right? It really depends on the individual. Some people, like my father, stayed in that home until he died. We knew the impact that living in that home had on us. That's why my aunt, a few years later, would refer to it as a mausoleum. What's it like to live in a mausoleum? Not too fun for a child of 8 or 10 or 12. For my father, it was comfort. For us, not so much. So it really depends on what it's doing to the individual. Sometimes a person might need a year or a couple of years of grieving within that space. I've worked with mothers who have lost infants, who couldn't leave that nursery that was prepared for that infant for well over a year, and would sit in rockers until they couldn't anymore, until it became so numbing and they realized, I have a life outside of this nursery and my child is really gone. Would I move to removing that mother from that nursery before her time? Absolutely not. Does it become paralyzing after a while? Certainly. Because, right, we know factually and realistically that child's not coming back no matter how much that mother rocks in that rocker. But this is part of her grieving process, and it has to be honored. I think that hospices have been the kind of intermediary. They have been like the social workers institutionally of our culture that have helped us in terms of a stepping stone. From a factual standpoint or just a practical standpoint, I think that hospices are things that sometimes families that are in need and don't have a lot of extended family where they could actually have a mother or father, an aging parent go and live with them. They don't have a lot of offspring or any offspring, so hospices become the default and the only option for them. But I think culturally speaking, I think hospices have been that intermediary for us as a way of helping us with what has been a real blind spot for us culturally, which is not really being able to do. I think hospice and hospice workers help us along with that. They really are able to, that's their job. They're equipped to actually help people in terms of end of life, to give them the best care that they can get, but also to help the family and the family constellation deal with what's about to come. So it's really kind of a stepping stone, if you will. You know, not all cultures and not all societies have hospice care. They have different forms of it. And if you were to look at certain nomadic tribes and stuff, it's really, you know, the extended tribe that winds up being that hospice care. Or you look at the example of what happened in the 80s and early 90s, right up until the mid-90s, here in New York during the AIDS crisis. Right? Gay men were hospice care for one another. It was chosen family. And here were not only gay men, but later women, okay, within the prime of their lives, okay, being lost. And not only were the families not equipped to deal with that loss, that sudden loss, okay, but their extended family, their chosen family couldn't deal with it. So it was a war zone. So hospice care was something that happened almost instantaneously. It happened rather naturally.